Use headphones for best experience.
Sergei trekked through the frozen woodland of southern Siberia under the wan light of a winter dawn. Each step crunching in snow brought him closer to the remote village quarantined by the military weeks ago. Rumors of a plague, some hideous flesh-eating sickness, had turned this area near Lake Baikal into an exclusion zone. Sergei's heart pounded at what he might find, but he had to know the fate of his family. The disappearance of farmers, then entire villages going silent, had drawn in police and eventually special forces who swiftly sealed off the region. Sergei had slipped past the perimeter under cover of night, driven by desperation and guilt. Now, atop a ridge of pines, he beheld his hometown in the gray morning, a cluster of cottages and a church steeple jutting from a pall of unnatural stillness. Even from afar, Sergei sensed something was terribly wrong. Many buildings were fire-scorched as if a blaze had swept through and died out on its own. Others remained intact but appeared wrong. Their walls glistened wetly in places, coated with some pallid growth that he first mistook for frost. Corpses, or what remained of them, lay scattered in the open, half buried in snow, fused to the earth by a spreading mass of diseased flesh. He crept closer, muffling his steps. The village that once bustled with life now sat in eerie silence, inhabited only by misshapen silhouettes shambling between houses. Sergei counted dozens of figures moving with unnatural twitches. Some stood utterly still, rooted in place by grotesque fleshy tendrils that merged their legs into the ground. Others wandered aimlessly, sometimes clustering together with a bizarre semblance of social order. There must be nearly 80 of them, he thought with a shudder, recalling overheard radio chatter of an infected population estimate. Pulling his scarf tighter around his mouth and nose, Sergei advanced down a side lane. A fetid odor hung in the air, sweet, rotten, and cloying, growing stronger as he neared the heart of the village. He flattened himself behind a charred shed as two infected villagers shambled past. They had once been human. Now their forms were obscenely altered. One man's head lolled on an elongated neck, his jaw distended and drooling strands of sinew. Sprouting from his torso were additional limb-like growths tipped with splayed fingers that flexed involuntarily. The figure beside him was hunched under layers of scabrous skin that writhed as if alive. Sergei held his breath. The infected pair passed without noticing him. Their eyes, where visible, were milky and unfocused. He recalled a warning. If these creatures still had sight and spotted him, they would attack, but blind ones might ignore anything beyond about 30 meters. Praying these two were as blind as they appeared, Sergei slipped into the shadows of an old cottage once they moved on. Inside the modest home, his neighbor Kolyada's house, he realized. Sergei found the front door already ajar. The interior was dim and reeked of decay. His boots squelched on something soft and yielding instead of the expected wooden floorboards. He looked down and nearly cried out. The entire floor was carpeted in a thin layer of pale, pulsing flesh. It crept up the walls in veiny vines, completely subsuming the humble decorations that once made this a home. Sergei stepped carefully, fighting a wave of nausea. In the living room sat two figures. One he recognized as Kolyada, or what was left of him. He was slumped in an armchair, skin bloated and fused into the upholstery, eyes closed as if in deep sleep. Beside him on the floor knelt another infected villager, one Sergei didn't know, perhaps from a neighboring hamlet. That one had no face left, only a mass of fleshy tendrils wriggling where a head should be, swaying gently as if sniffing the air. Sergei froze. Neither creature reacted to his presence. They seemed inert, maybe resting. A wet gurgling noise from the next room made Sergei's blood run cold. Beyond a doorway lay the kitchen and dining area, illuminated by the feeble gray light through frost-laced windows. Sergei crept forward and peered in. A nightmare tableau unfolded in that dining room. He saw an infected man standing at the head of the table. Once a person, now scarcely identifiable. This being's face had split open into a writhing mass of flesh strips or tendrils that hung down like gruesome vermicelli. Despite its horrific mutilation, the creature moved with purpose around the table, where 3 cracked ceramic plates were set out as if for supper. On the far side of the room, propped in a bed against the wall, lay another grotesque figure, its body swollen and merged into the filthy mattress. The bedridden monstrosity flailed weakly with malformed arms while emitting a wet wheeze. Sergei watched, mesmerized and sickened, as the standing creature, perhaps once the patriarch of this home, suddenly rushed to the bedside and began savagely pummeling the immobile one. Fist-like appendages thudded into the bloated form over and over with dull, meaty impacts. The bedridden beta gurgled and thrashed but could not rise from the bed. This beating continued for an interminable minute until a shrill, inhuman shriek burst from the bedbound creature. In a spasm, the thing's chest ruptured open, spraying a plume of thick, clotted spore cloud into the air. Sergei clapped a hand over his mouth, stifling a gasp. The standing creature, he dubbed it Alpha, leaned into the floating cloud of spores, its face tendrils quivering as if savoring a mist of fine perfume. Across the room, a third infected, something small and contorted lurking under the dining table, began to spasm as the spores drifted over it, limbs twitching in epileptic fury. Sergei shrank back behind the doorframe, fearful that the toxic cloud might waft his way. He watched Alpha complete a few slow circuits of the room, seemingly satisfied. The hulking thing then seated itself at the table and extended its facial tendrils onto each plate, tearing pieces of its own flesh off with a sickening rip. Sergei bit down on his knuckle to keep from retching as Alpha methodically heaped quivering chunks of its flesh onto the plates in a ghastly parody of serving dinner. When the plates were heaped high with wet, pulsing meat, the Alpha creature stood and shambled out through the front door, brushing past Sergei's hiding spot without a glance. Sergei pressed himself against the wall as the tall figure moved into the street. In its wake came a new gaggle of infected villagers, 6 or 7 of them, slouching through the doorway single file. This shambling congregation ignored Sergei completely. Their gazes, where eyes remained, were fixed on the flesh-laden table. He watched in morbid fascination as the group descended on the plates, each creature grabbing handfuls of the still warm flesh and shoving it into whatever orifice or wound they had available. Some crammed the meat into slobbering mouths, others pressed it into open chest cavities, a few even stuffing the chunks under loose flaps of skin under their arms. The dining room filled with wet squelches and low animal grunts of satisfaction. In moments, every plate was empty and smeared with gore. One by one, the infected diners shuffled out again, their strange meal concluded, leaving bloody smears trailing down their distended bodies. Sergei could no longer contain his terror. "I have to get out of here." There was nothing he could do for these people. They were lost, consumed by the flesh plague beyond hope. But what of his wife and young daughter? Had they ended up like that? He needed to reach his home on the far side of the village, but every path was crawling with monstrosities. Steeling himself, Sergei slipped out of the cottage once the feeding group dispersed. He kept low, darting behind an overturned truck and through a back alley cluttered with debris. As he passed the remnants of the local general store, he noticed its door hanging askew. A faint movement inside caught his eye. Perhaps someone hiding? Against his better judgment, Sergei pushed the door open just enough to peer within. The store's interior was dim and choked with the coppery stink of blood. Several infected milled about listlessly between barren shelves. One lay on the ground, rolling back and forth in a repetitive motion as if trapped in a loop, but the others paid it no heed. Sergei's gaze traveled to the checkout counter, and his stomach lurched. Protruding from a cellar hatch behind the counter was the upper half of a man in a Russian military uniform. The soldier's lower body was entirely jammed into the narrow cellar opening, fused into the fleshy growth that lined the trapdoor's edges. Yet the man was clearly still alive. Sergei could see his eyes darting about wildly in their sockets. The soldier's mouth opened and closed as if trying to scream, but only a wet hiss emerged. Their eyes met, and Sergei saw the plea in the man's expression. A silent beg for help or death. He could not tell. Before Sergei could even think how to respond, a violent convulsion seized the half-buried soldier. His eyes rolled back, and from his gaping mouth poured a thick rivulet of viscous, blood-tinged slime. Sergei stumbled away in horror, nearly tripping over the pile of corpses stacked in the rear storage room. He hadn't noticed them in the gloom. Dozens of bodies, villagers and military alike, heaped together and partially melted into one another in a mound of putrescence. Atop this grotesque pile writhed an infected abomination, its lower half fused deep into the mass of corpses. The upper half thrashed and spasmed, arms whipping erratically. Every few seconds, the creature's chest or back would expel a burst of spores that hung in the air like fine dust. One of those clouds was drifting straight towards Sergei. That snapped him out of his paralysis. He bolted out of the store's side door, coughing, brushing frantically at his coat in case any of that infectious matter had settled on him. Heart hammering, Sergei found himself near the center of the village now, by the old stone well in the plaza. Snow had begun to fall, fat flakes landing on the unnaturally warm ground and immediately melting. He skidded to a halt at the site surrounding the well. A ring of figures stood hand in hand, arms outstretched and linked in a chain around the well's perimeter. They were utterly motionless, like a circle of frozen statues, except one. On the far side of the well, breaking the chain, a single infected woman hung back, arms slack at her sides. Her head was tilted downward as if she were weeping, face hidden by long, matted hair. Sergei instinctively ducked behind a splintered cart, observing this bizarre tableau. The ring of linked infected all faced inward toward the dark maw of the well. What are they doing, he wondered. The gap in the circle where the woman stood unlinked gave him a view of the well's opening. Down inside, something faintly glowed or shimmered. Perhaps bioluminescent fungus or flesh, he guessed. The sight was hypnotic, and dread seeped into Sergei's gut as he realized the statues around the well were not just standing, but growing. Their feet had fused to the ground, fleshy tendrils snaking out from their legs into the soil. They had rooted themselves in place like macabre trees around a watering hole. Suddenly, with a brittle jerk, the unlinked woman's head snapped up. Sergei bit back a cry. Her face, in stark contrast to her grotesquely bloated body, was that of a young girl, perfectly preserved and human. It was the face of an innocent child, untainted, wide-eyed, and eerily emotionless. That uncanny face turned and looked directly at Sergei's hiding spot. Before he could react, the woman's bloated form lurched forward with shocking speed. She closed the distance in seconds, and Sergei only just scrambled back as she lunged around the cart with a gore-streaked hand. Her touch fell short by inches. Up close, her childlike face was even more disturbing. It had an angelic softness, framed by filthy hair, a mask of normalcy grafted onto an abominable body. The woman's lips parted, and her face ballooned outward, splitting into a splay of wet, fleshy flaps that opened like the petals of a grotesque flower. From within that blooming mass came several coiling tendrils that whipped toward Sergei. He screamed, falling backwards. A tendril snagged his boot, another slithered around his left wrist with slimy strength. The flaps flexed, pulling with surprising force. She was trying to drag him into her gaping maw. Panic flooded Sergei's mind. He kicked frantically with his free leg and managed to brace it against the woman's distended belly. Her flesh was hot and disturbingly soft, sinking under his boot. With a roar of effort, Sergei yanked his arm free from the tendril and snatched a flare from his belt. He hadn't wanted to use it. Open flame could attract more infected. But now there was no choice. He thumbed the cap and ignited the flare. In the same motion, he jammed it straight into the woman creature's blossomed face. There was a hiss and a stench of burning meat. The tendrils recoiled instantly, and a high-pitched wail came from deep within her throat. Sergei scrambled back, kicking loose from the coil on his boot. The infected woman reeled, her facial flaps charring around the edges from the magnesium flame. Seizing his chance, Sergei got to his feet and ran. He sprinted past the circle of standing infected, none of whom reacted, still locked hand in hand around the well, and fled toward the northern road out of the village. Behind him rose a muffled cacophony. Inhuman shrieks and roars echoed through the air. Sergei risked a glance over his shoulder. Something was happening to the infected villagers en masse. The chained figures around the well had begun seizing and convulsing violently, their linked arms quivering but still intact. Across the plaza, other monstrosities collapsed to the ground, writhing as if in agony. One by one, the rooted infected that had been fused to buildings or soil withered and shriveled, their flesh drying into blackened husks. Sergei skidded to a stop in shock. It was as if some unseen force had struck all the creatures at once. The woman he'd burned was flailing blindly, Smoke rising from her grotesque face, she tripped and fell, lying unnaturally still afterward. Sergei's initial thought was that perhaps his flare had somehow triggered a chain reaction. But no, this was too sudden, too widespread. From the south, a distant boom reverberated, and the very ground under Sergei's feet trembled. It sounded like an explosion far away, followed by an uncanny, resonant roar carrying over the frozen land. The noise seemed both geological and animal, as if a mountain itself had bellowed in pain. For a long moment, Sergei stood panting in the middle of the road, surrounded by twitching, infected, and rapidly decaying flesh growths. He realized in astonishment that many of the monstrosities were dying. The ones that had been mobile struggled back up after their spasms, but they no longer took any notice of him. Instead, every surviving infected in the plaza began shambling in unison toward one large house at the edge of the village, an old two-story manor that once belonged to the mayor. Sergei watched in bewilderment as dozens of creatures poured through the manor's door, down into its foundation. Their combined weight and frantic movement proved too much. With a thunderous crack, the entire building collapsed and sank into the earth, as though something beneath had yanked it down. A cloud of dust and snow billowed up as the ground caved, leaving a gaping sinkhole where the manor had stood. Sergei staggered backward. From the newly opened abyss wafted a blast of heated air, stinking of rot and sulfur. He heard an echoing howl from deep underground, and for a moment he thought he saw massive shapes stirring in the darkness below. That was enough. Whatever had drawn the infected below ground, Sergei wanted no part of it. With the village effectively emptied of its monstrosities, either dead or lured into that pit, he had a brief window to escape. Anna, Katya, their names pounded in his head. He had found no sign of his wife or daughter among the carnage above. A faint, foolish hope fluttered in his chest. Could they somehow still live, maybe hiding or taken below? He forced himself to turn away from the sinkhole. He could not face what lurked beneath, not now. There was only one thing he could do for his family: make it out alive and inform the authorities. If there was any hope of saving survivors, it lay in getting help. Snow whirled as Sergei fled into the forest, retracing his path out of the nightmare village. The cries of the infected had ceased behind him, replaced by an uncanny silence, broken only by the crackle of distant flames and the sighing of wind. Sergei did not look back again. Half stumbling, half running, he followed the path to the perimeter, where armed men would shoot him on sight for crossing unannounced. Better to be shot than to be consumed by the flesh that hated all life, he thought with a grim resignation. He emerged from the tree line, hands raised, shouting hoarsely before the floodlights of a military outpost. "Don't shoot! I'm human! I'm clean!" Guards in winter camouflage rushed forward, rifles trained on him. Sergei collapsed to his knees, exhausted, covered in grime and bits of gore not his own. As rough hands and rubber gloves pinned him and began to hose him down with disinfectant, Sergei allowed himself a final glance toward the village. The horizon glowed faintly with an orange tint, as if fires burned beneath the snow. Above the doomed settlement, a lone murder of crows circled in the ashen sky, their cries lost to the wind. He had survived the village, but the true horror, he feared, was only beginning. Beneath the earth, the infection waited.
End of Chapter 1. To be continued.
If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.